Hello, citizens, and welcome to Histories and Mysteries Redux Exodus Part 2, where we talk about basic ancient Egyptian history and review the Exodus story. With me, yes, I know, yeah, just bear with me, Bill Burris. What is Redux? I've taken classes from Histories and Mysteries, various classes that I've taught at the church, and I'm rerunning them here. They're modified from their original content, from what I had originally done, updated them a bit, changed them to be more convenient for this online environment. And in this case, for Exodus, I have 9. That's right, 9 Exodus. So let's pretend, let's get started here. Grab your caffeinated beverage of choice. Pretend it's Woody's Fair Trade Blend. That's pretty good, Joe. Go ahead and pretend. Take a seat in the back of the classroom in good Presbyterian fashion. Look to the left, to the whiteboard, for the terrible dumb joke. We always put one up there. In this case, it's on the bottom of your slide. There it is. And, oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, that one's, sorry about that. Our passage for the day here is from Isaiah 63, verses 11 through 14. Then they remembered the days of old, of Moses his servant. Where is the one who brought them up out of the sea with the shepherds of his flock? Where is the one who put within them his Holy Spirit, who caused his glorious arm to march at the right hand of Moses, who divided the waters before them to make for himself an everlasting name, who led them through the depths like a horse in the desert? They did not stumble. Like cattle that go down into the valley, the Spirit of the Lord gave them rest. Thus you lead your people to make for yourself a glorious name. The much dreaded agenda here. We're going to do the opening prayer. We'll talk some caveats and disclaimers. We're going to go over the schedule. We're going to talk about sources, a couple other things. Then we're going to go into basic ancient Egyptian history, and then a review of the Exodus story itself. So here we go, the opening prayer. If you know it, say it with me. Dear Lord, even though Bill is teaching us, may we please learn something of value. Amen. Okay, you got to turn on your super small voice for this, the super fast one, for caveats and and as I've mentioned before, during at least for the purposes of these classes, when I talk about traditional history, I'm talking about based on religious text or religious tradition. And when I'm talking about conventional history or conventional understanding, that is based on a current academic consensus, as if you could actually get a bunch of academics to actually develop a consensus. But, well, as close as you can get to that anyway. The greatly feared schedule. So last week was just an introduction. This week we're talking about basic Egyptian history and the review of the Exodus story. Next week we're going to go into the origins and dealing with Joseph. Then we're going to talk about the time when an Exodus occurred. That's week 4. The 10 plagues. That's week 5. The actual route of the Exodus is 6. Jericho and the conquest of Canaan, week 7. Other theories of the Exodus in week 8. And then lastly, week 9, kind of wrapping it all up and tying the Exodus back to Jesus, where it should belong. Our sources, again, for the scientific stuff, I'm pulling from The Miracles of Exodus by Colin J. Humphreys and The Parting of the Sea by Barbara J. Silverstein. And for basic Egyptian history, it's Bob Breyer's great course, The History of Ancient Egypt. And when I start talking about new chronology stuff, David Roll's books are listed here, and the videos that he's got, you might be able to find the older one on YouTube and the newer one on whatever streaming service you want. The newer one is the Patterns of Evidence. There will probably be geology, maybe? We'll find out. Yeah, okay. So, basic Egyptian history. That's what we're going to be talking about here. So, first of all, why does Egypt exist as a civilization center? Why? It's actually dominated by its geography, the way it's set up. It's got this river running through the desert. This is only a part of the river, the northern part that we see here. The green part up at the top, this is the Egyptian delta, or the delta of the Nile. Hence the reason it's called a delta, because it's triangle shaped. I don't know whether the Greeks named the delta, the triangle, the delta based off the shape of the Nile Delta or the other way around. Doesn't matter. This is where we get the term delta from. This is the delta that the Greeks used as kind of like the predominant delta, the Nile Delta. This is a great grain producing area. The entire Roman Empire was dependent upon the grain output of this small wedge of green land extending out into the Mediterranean Sea from the Nile River. The Nile River flows from the south to the north to the Mediterranean. And what's fantastic about the Nile is that it flows to the north, but the prevailing winds blow to the south. So if you're going to conduct commerce, if you're going to ship things down the river, all you got to do is put your sails down and flow down the river with the current. And if you want to get back up the river, all you had to do is put your sails up and let the wind blow you back towards the south. And as a result, you had everything you could possibly need to set up a civilization. You had water, you had a river. The river would flood annually, bringing down silt. The flooding of the river would put the silt out in the fields and fertilize the fields and replenish the fields. So as a result, you're able to generate all this kind of surplus food, which would allow a civilization to grow. Our conventional understanding of Egyptian history is based upon the works of these three folks. Herodotus, who wrote in the 4th century BC, he was a kind of like a Greek tourist visiting Egypt. Manetho, who we don't know a whole bunch about. In fact, we don't even have many of his original writings. We have references to him by other historians. And then Josephus in the 1st century AD. None of these guys are primary sources. They're all writing their stuff secondhand. And in fact, Manetho himself is being referred to as a secondhand. So we also have to rely on a mix of archaeology and translations of Egyptian texts that were written close to the time of the events themselves. So let's get started in the very beginning here. Around 3200 BC is when we start understanding the concept of a unified Egypt, that there was two Egypts, a northern Egypt close to the Mediterranean and a southern Egypt along the Nile River flowing out into the desert. And now archaeologists have named the early Bronze Age culture here the Naqada III, or the proto-dynastic culture. That's kind of like pre-kingdom. And then you're starting to see the development of hieroglyphics in the archaeology, royal tombs, and one of the first things that we see, the first royal personages we see in an artifact is called the Scorpion King, because there's a little scorpion symbol that shows up on the hieroglyphics next to him. Now the first dynasty is established to be maybe around 3100 BC, maybe, when a pharaoh named Menes or Namur first unified the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And he combined the two kingdoms, and he therefore combined the two crowns. The white crown from one kingdom, the red crown from the other, into a single crown. And from that point on, the pharaoh always wore this exact type of crown representing the two kingdoms. And during this time, the kings were buried in royal tombs called mastabas, which were slabs, usually of mud brick, sometimes eventually of stone, out in the desert. Archaeologists believe that previous kings were buried out in the desert without these mastabas on top of them. And then what happened? The wind would blow, the desert winds would erode away the soil, and the king would be exposed. Oh, horror of horrors. So these mastabas were built over the burial sites of these kings to protect their remains from the effects of wind and erosion. They call these mastabas. From the 3rd to the 6th dynasties, and each dynasty is kind of like a family, a group of pharaohs related to each other. They tended to be established in one location, and when one dynasty changed to another, they often changed their capital, their point of rule from one location to another. So the Old Kingdom runs from around 2700 to 2100 BC, the 3rd to the 6th dynasties, and during the 3rd dynasty, the Pharaoh Djoser, again, according to the conventional chronology, maybe 2650 BC is when he ruled, built the first step period. And you can take a look at that step pyramid. It still exists. And it's pretty obvious that it's just a series of mastabas, one stacked up on another. The 4th dynasty is the dynasty where we start going pyramid nuts. So the 4th dynasty is when we start getting pyramids that are no longer steps but actual smooth sides up to a point. And the Great Pyramid was built in 2500 BC by Khufu, the Pharaoh Khufu, and his family. At around 2200, we get what we call the First Intermediate Period, a time of political or economic instability. Things were falling apart. We don't have much records. We don't know what was going on at that point in time. Maybe Egypt was no longer unified under a single ruler. We start getting into the pharaohs of the 7th and 8th dynasties actually being in different locations than the pharaohs of the 9th and 10th dynasties, yet maybe they were actually living at the same time. They're concurrent with each other, that there are rival dynasties struggling for rule over the whole. Pyramids are getting much, much smaller. And this is one of the things that archaeologists and historians look to indicate of this lack of political unity and lack of economic and political stability, is that nobody's building giant pyramids anymore. They're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. In other words, the pharaoh doesn't have the resources and the ability anymore to create these giant pyramids. And we have far fewer structures without the graffiti on them. Right now, our best source for what you would call primary source are the walls of the temples, where the Egyptian pharaoh would write and have all the stuff proclaimed about all the great stuff he did. And we find very few of these types of records, very few structures, very little writing on the walls of those structures from this time. So it's almost a dark age in terms of our understanding. And we're starting to see alternative or rival kingdoms show up in the Egyptian Delta area. So the kings of those new kingdoms are associated with the 9th and the 10th dynasties. And they've been around, or probably were around at the same time that another kingdom to the south was centered on Thebes out in the desert. After this first intermediate period, Egypt gets unified again under the 11th and 12th dynasty, which are based out of Thebes, and they still use pyramids. But then you enter a second intermediate period, roughly starting around 1800 and running to maybe 1600, possibly 1500 BC. After the 13th dynasty weakens and dwindles in Thebes, a group of people show up called the Hyksos. We're going to keep this name in mind for future relevance throughout this entire class. The Hyksos, a non-Egyptian people, show up, and they establish rival dynasties up in the Delta area. And as a result, Egypt is again fractured. And you got many pharaohs and many dynasties showing up, many of which are not even Egyptian. They're foreign born or foreigners, these Hyksos or other folks who spoke Semitic languages. This is going to be relevant to our conversations in the future. Following this second intermediate period, we have the period that historians refer to as the New Kingdom, starting roughly around 1600 BC, running to around 1100 BC. A vibrant, vigorous pharaoh, Ahmose I, beats the snot out of the Hyksos, chases them out of Egypt, and unites Egypt under what we now refer to as the 18th dynasty. And he instigates or moves all the burials from the kings from this point on. They don't occur in the pyramids anymore, but they are now buried in the Valley of the Kings. Later on, Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten and starts a monotheistic religion, roughly around 1330 BC. That religion doesn't last too long. His son, Tutankhamun, probably as a boy king, under pressure or manipulation from the powers that be, starts instigating or reestablishing the traditional polytheistic Egyptian religion that his father had worked so hard to abolish. Now, I've covered a lot of history in just a few minutes under just a few slides, but to give you a sense of how much time we're talking about here, when King Tut looked out across the desert and saw the Great Pyramids, those pyramids were over 1,000 years old. There's more time that separated King Tut from the construction of those pyramids than separates us from the First Crusade. So you got to get a sense, even though I glossed over it very quickly, how much time Egypt had been around as a civilization. So the New Kingdom, again, runs from 1600 to 1100, and it's got a great many outstanding, notable pharaohs. One of them, the greatest known possibly, is Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, and he brings Egypt to its height of power and influence from maybe 1279 to 1213 BC. And he is often considered, or he is considered, the traditional Pharaoh of the Exodus by many traditional religious sources, because it was he who built the city of Pi Ramses. Now, at around 1100 BC, the end of the Bronze Age, we get into a period what we call the Bronze Age collapse. This also starts the third intermediate period, a period of a relative disruption to the Egyptian state and disunity and mixed dynasties, rival dynasties at the same time. So dynasties 21 through 25 through this third intermediate period. Meanwhile, throughout the Middle East, in Turkey, Greece, Mesopotamia, there's all kinds of disruptions going on that we call or associate with an event we call the Bronze Age collapse. The Hittite Empire gets completely destroyed. Their capital, Hattusa, gets sacked and destroyed. The Mycenaeans of Greece disappear as a culture. Many cities throughout Palestine and Mesopotamia are mysteriously sacked, and many cities are just abandoned and left. The reasons for these are varied. Raiders, pirates, barbarian invaders, however you want to put it. Also, a lot of people suggest that climate change may have been a factor, if not in the actual abandonment of some of these cities where water became too scarce to sustain life, but also for driving migration or groups of people from places that can't sustain them anymore to new locations. Now, after the Bronze Age collapse and after this intermediate period, then Egypt starts falling onto hard times because the Assyrians and then the Persians take over, and Egypt is very rarely ruled by Egyptians from this point on. And at around 330, Alexander the Great conquers the Persians. That means he also conquers Egypt. Now, this is the same kind of pattern he sets up that existed before. He had the Egyptians fighting the wars with the various entities of Mesopotamia, and so on and so forth. And that pattern reemerges after the death of Alexander. It's just that the leaders of each of these rival civilizations is now Macedonian. Alexander's generals take over, and in Egypt, that means it's the Ptolemies. So Egypt is now being ruled by Macedonians, or Greeks, if you will, from this point on. The last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, the last Pharaoh of Egypt, if you will, is Cleopatra. And she dies in 30 BC. So, yeah, thanks, Mark Anthony. So that was a quick review of Egypt's history. Let's go over again a quick review of the Exodus story. We are going to go through this really, really quickly. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time in it. So, if you run into any kind of issues where, hey, I don't remember that, go look it up. It's in the book of Exodus. Okay? But we're going to stop and look at some details and items that you may not remember much from Sunday school. Also, I carry certain themes or bring up certain themes throughout the narrative that I think are consistent. So let's take a look. So setting the stage, Exodus 1. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. So, population control, right? That's one of the impetuses here. Exodus 1, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Okay, so obviously they want less Israelites around. Just a short intermission here, a short break. One of the most controversial topics of the New Testament among historians and scholars is the massacre of the innocents depicted in the Gospel of Matthew, where Herod orders the death of all these children in Bethlehem to ensure that the king of the Jews does not arrive. And Joseph gets warned in a dream, and he takes his family and he flees to Egypt. And there's a lot of parallels between this and the Exodus story, and some scholars argue that these parallels are deliberate, that the story is made up to help make the Christian religion more palatable to Jews who cherish the Exodus story and the stories associated with the Exodus, that it's propaganda to help evangelize with the Jews. I'm not going to argue one way or the other. All I will say is that from what archaeological and historical evidence we have about Herod, he at least was psychologically capable of ordering a massacre like this. All right, moving on. So, Moses learned to sail really early. Okay, and he, of course, was found in a basket in the river by the daughter of Pharaoh and was raised in the royal household. Another short intermission. It turns out there's other stories like this, at least one in particular. Mesopotamian legend relates that Sargon the Great of Acadia was placed in a reed basket and sent down the river by his mother. He was rescued by Akwi, who then adopted him as his own son. So there's a very similar story out of Mesopotamian literature as there is here in the Exodus story. All right, let's get back to it here. Moses, after he grows up, kills an overseer who is persecuting Israelite slaves, And then he flees Egypt because he doesn't want to be charged with murder. And he flees to Midian. Now, where is Midian? Midian is in this area of Saudi Arabia, down near the Gulf of Aqaba. So here's the Gulf of Suez. Here's the Gulf of Aqaba, both on the northern part of the Red Sea. And Moses fled from Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula into this part of Saudi Arabia, which we now refer to, well, it's now Saudi Arabia, but then at the time, historically, in ancient times, this was known as Midian. Moses settles down, marries, and does nothing much more than herd sheep. Then one day he ends up having a conversation with a burning plant. So God instructs Moses to get his brother and free the Israelites. So Moses and his brother go to Pharaoh to make the pitch. Exodus 5. Afterward Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence and sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors." Why 3 days? I still wonder. So Moses goes, "Let my people go." And of course Pharaoh says, "No way." And Moses, "Yahweh." Yeah, that wasn't that funny. So we start on the 10 plagues. The first plague is the water of the Nile turns to blood. The second plague is the plague of frogs. The third plague is the plague of gnats or lice. The fourth is swarms of flies. The fifth, livestock get sick and die. 6 is boils. 7 is hail. 8 is locusts. 9 is darkness. And 10, the firstborn boys die. Let's just stop the story for a moment here. During the entire time of the plagues, we are reminded that it is God who hardens Pharaoh's heart. Exodus 7. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of this land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt." It's a reminder throughout the Exodus text that during these times of the plagues, that God is in charge of even Pharaoh's decision making, so to speak. We now move on to that whole part about the parting of the waters. Everybody gets across the Red Sea. And throughout the entire Exodus, we got this theme, at least I detect, where when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, what do the Israelites do? They complain. Moses parts the water. What do the Israelites do? They complain. Moses makes brackish water good to drink. They complain. Moses arranges for manna for food. The Israelites complain. Moses will hit a rock to make more water, and they will still complain. Moses brings them to Mount Sinai and gives them the law of God. The Israelites try to make a new God. What have we learned here? Well, we've learned that the Israelites are not just hard-headed people, so to speak. After Moses gets the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, spies go off into Canaan, and 10 out of the 12 spies are nervous. And well, the Israelites complain. God finally blows a cork and vows to wipe them all out. Moses intercedes, and the final judgment by God is 40 years in the desert. So after 40 years, the Israelites then beat up everybody east of the Jordan River. Balaam beats his ass. Moses writes it all down. He sings a song, and then he dies. Joshua then moves in, conquers Jericho and the rest of the land of the Canaan, and the Israelites then divide up the land of Canaan amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. And that is a very quick summation of the basic Exodus story. So, whew, we're done, right? No. Got another presentation to do. In fact, we got several because there's 9 in total. Next time, we're going to talk about Joseph and the Israelites. Until then, thanks for listening. Really appreciate it.